Mind, consciousness and the brain is currently one of the great frontiers in science and philosophy. Many atheists say that our experience of thinking, feeling and being me is an illusion foisted on us by an entirely physical process in our brain. Others are pushing beyond those materialist explanations, and we're going to be examining some different approaches today. Philip Goff is a philosopher and consciousness researcher at Durham University. Now, he wouldn't necessarily describe himself as a Christian, we'll get into that in a moment, but he is unsatisfied with atheist materialist explanations of consciousness. And in his brand new book, Galileo's Error, Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness, Philip argues for a new understanding of consciousness known as Panpsychism. Sharon Dirckx is a senior tutor at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics and has a background in neuroscience research. Her new book, Am I Just My Brain?, also challenges the materialist view of mind and consciousness, with Sharon arguing that our experience of being embodied human selves points ultimately to God. Looking forward to this programme. Sharon and Philip, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
I want to talk about both of your journeys as it regards writing these books. Perhaps we'll start with you, Sharon, and your background, because it's very interesting that you're writing a book on the brain and you do have a background in neuroscience.
I thought you were going to say I do have a brain, which is obviously a helpful starting point.
Tell us, because I think when you got into science as an undergraduate, you weren't actually a Christian either. So how has those two journeys gone together as well?
Yes, so I grew up not really believing anything in particular, although I do. One of my earliest childhood memories is of sitting by a window looking at the rain, slightly bored on a weekend afternoon, and suddenly the thought popping into my head, why can I think? Why do I exist? I was suddenly aware of my own consciousness.
Quite a deep thought to be having on
yes,
that rainy day.
I can't remember exactly how old I was, maybe 9, 10, 11, who knows. But I really remember that moment, and I wasn't being raised a religious nor was I being kind of fed anything that was unhelpful on a religious realm. So it was fairly neutral. And I actually, my A-level biology teacher, because by then I knew from an early age that I loved the sciences, pointed me towards Richard Dawkins, and I read The Selfish Gene in the 1980s about how we are biological machines. And I arrived at university probably agnostic. I'd kind of absorbed some of this materialistic perspective, but I arrived fairly agnostic, and probably with the assumption that science and belief in God were incompatible. And quite early on in my time at university, I was able to ask the question to Christians, surely you can't believe in God and be a scientist, or at least not a credible one, and was told actually you can. These are mutually compatible explanations that both together give a complete sense of reality, and we actually need both the underlying mechanism and the one whose idea it was and continues to uphold everything today. And so I changed my views about God as a young adult at the age of 19, in the middle of a biochemistry degree where I was studying these mechanisms. And this was in the 1990s, a time that was very exciting for biochemistry. There were lots of areas that were undiscovered. You know, the Human Genome Project was just underway. And so there were lots of gaps in our knowledge, but those gradually
Your story reminds me a bit of Alistair McGrath, who I'm sure you know, who was also, I think, studying biochemistry at Oxford as an undergraduate when he had a conversion. So it's not unheard of, is it, for the science and the faith to come together in that way. But tell us about the neuroscience, because that is obviously where your scientific career took you.
Yes, it did. So I actually loved the discoveries of biochemistry, but didn't very much enjoy the practice of them, pipetting tiny amounts of material from one test tube to another. And when there's an electricity cut, you lose your last 3 months of work. I wanted to study something on a larger level, and I was drawn to magnetic resonance imaging. I was drawn to this emerging area of research, and I pursued a PhD in functional MRI of the brain, which I did at Cambridge. And this is an incredible technique that's arisen in our lifetime, really, which enables scientists to look inside the brains of healthy volunteers. Prior to brain imaging techniques, a lot of physiology and neuroscience was conducted on post-mortem studies or on those in disease states that were willing to be studied. But this brain imaging techniques enable scientists to look inside the brains of healthy people without invading them. And so it really changed the whole landscape of neuroscience.
For someone who's not particularly familiar with the area, if they had seen pictures of images of brains lighting up in different parts and that kind of thing, that's probably a result of this imaging technology.
Yes, most people have encountered MRI in terms of having a structural scan, so perhaps a knee or a shoulder or their brain perhaps. And there they're looking at changes in the structure of that thing. But there's also a type of brain imaging called functional MRI, where you're looking at the changes in brain activity in response to particular tasks that a person might have. So you put them in a scanner, which is a bit like a giant toilet roll, and you give them an activity to do that's been designed in a very precise way to localize the brain areas that are involved in that task. So early on in functional MRI, the primary functions of the cortex were studied a lot, things like vision and hearing and motor function. And people saw the visual cortex, auditory cortex, motor cortex light up in response to these the uses of these parts of the brain.
They've even done, I believe, studies when people pray or even speak in tongues. What bits of the brain are lighting up. Now, we may or may not have time to go into that today, but there's been an interesting interface in that sense between people's claimed spiritual experiences and what's going on in the brain.
Yes, and I think there's been a progression since it arrived in the 1990s. Started off looking at primary functions, just trying to understand what can we see using this technique in terms of the fundamental features of the brain, and then moving on to kind of cognitive tasks, uses of different mental tasks such as working memory or different types of cognition and higher thinking. And looking at which brain regions are involved in those tasks. And then moving on even further to looking at the effect of drugs or, as you say, of religious experience on the brain. That's an area known as neurotheology, where theology intersects with neuroscience.
And I know that you cover that a little bit in the book as well. I mean, the book itself, as I see it, is a response to the emergence of a very naturalistic, materialistic view of the brain, the mind, of consciousness that's emerged, especially from people like Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris and others. Do you want to just spell out that view and what your task was in the book in terms of looking at the neuroscience, the philosophy behind this, and sort of where you come out ultimately in the end?
Yes, so I think Philip and I are probably in agreement on this, that the prevailing landscape for philosophy and neuroscience is a strongly materialistic one. Journals like New Scientist and Scientific American, there's really no hint of any other worldview other than the materialistic one, and the outworking of that in neuroscience is the view that you are your brain. There are lots of different ways of looking at the human person, but actually neuroscience, now that it's uncovering all of these mechanisms, that some have drawn the conclusion that those mechanisms dictate everything about you, the behaviors you exhibit, the choices that you make, the religious beliefs that you hold are all dictated by the activity in your brain. And I argue in my book, Am I Just My Brain, that this view, not only is it not what the neuroscience is showing us, we don't need to go far beyond this very domain in order to see that isn't the case, but also it leads to a very diminished view of the human person with significant implications for ethics, for AI, what we believe will ultimately be possible, and for free will as well. And so I really look at all of these different areas, and I show that my intention was not to argue for a particular mind-body position, but rather to argue against a reductive approach to the human person by showing that actually there are many other options available that many thinking philosophers and scientists hold that help us make more sense of the human person and more sense of the neuroscience.
Which is a good point to bring Philip into the equation as a thinking philosopher himself.
Try to be.
You were on the show not too long ago, Philip, talking about religious fictionalism with Christy Mayer, which was a fascinating programme and is why I hesitated to give you a label at the beginning of the show. you are someone who goes to church,
Mm-hmm.
finds great meaning in the practice of Christian ritual, but are as yet uncommitted to a lot of the doctrinal elements of that.
I'm
Would
probably
that be a
stronger than that. I mean, I positively believe it's false.
Okay, fair enough. All
At
right.
least, I'm definitely an atheist about God as traditionally conceived
Okay.
because of the problem of evil, which I think is one of the most compelling philosophical arguments there is.
It's funny we should have Sharon on, because her last book before this one was on that very subject.
Oh, we'll have to do
but
that
that's a
another time.
debate for another day.
But
As it stands, yes.
But, I think, I do believe that there is a moral and a spiritual aspect to reality, and that's as real as what we know about reality scientifically. And I guess I see the purposes of religion as to connect individuals and community up to that moral and spiritual aspect. And Christianity in particular, I think the story of Christianity, the story of identifying God with the naked, executed peasant, the person who shunned the wealthy and powerful and ate with outcasts and lepers. I think, although it's perhaps not literally true, I think at a metaphorical level, it expresses a deep truth about the nature of moral and spiritual reality. So that's why it's important.
Well,
to
I
me.
only wish we had time to go into that discussion, but as I say, for another show perhaps. Really, what you were coming on to discuss last time isn't your main area of research. It's what we're talking about today, consciousness. And in that sense, as you've indicated, you're an atheist as regards perhaps the Christian God at this point, but not quite the same sort of atheist as a Daniel Dennett or a Sam Harris, because you take quite a different view, as I understand it, of the nature of consciousness. You are equally, as it were, opposed to the materialist view, as Sharon is in that sense. So what led you into this whole area, and can you give us a brief sketch of where you try and draw things out in the book?
Yeah, well, I guess I've just always been obsessed by the problem of consciousness as far back as I can remember, really. I think what's fascinating about it is there's a sort of paradox that on the one hand, consciousness is the thing that's most familiar. Nothing is more evident than the reality of one's own feelings and experiences. But on the other hand, consciousness is the thing that's proved most challenging to incorporate into our standard scientific worldview, and I guess we can get into some of the reasons for that. But I suppose it's that combination of familiarity and mystery.
I was going to say, because
really
most of the time,
kind of captivating.
And unlike that deep thought you had as an 11-year-old, Sharon, we don't even think about consciousness, even though it's literally staring us in the face, because we're swimming in it. We don't really think about the fact that this is quite extraordinary, that we're having thoughts, feelings, visual experiences, because actually, as you elucidate so well in the book, it's very hard to understand how that exactly links in with a purely physical understanding of the universe.
Yeah, so nothing is more evident than this inner subjective world of colours and sounds and smells and tastes, and as you say, we kind of take it for granted, but we still don't have even the beginnings of an explanation of how complex electrochemical signalling is somehow able to give rise to that inner subjective world. So some people think this is we just need to do more neuroscience and we'll crack it, but I think the problem's a bit deeper than that. But so I mean, and I guess as a philosophy undergraduate, we were taught that there were only two options on consciousness, and by the end of my degree, materialism on the one hand.
That's the Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris approach.
Well, Sam Harris is actually, these guys have very different views.
Okay.
Sam Harris is actually, I believe, open to the view I defend, actually.
Okay,
I think
right.
he's certainly much more of a strong believer in consciousness than Daniel Dennett.
Okay.
His partner Annika Harris has just published a book which explores these issues and tentatively defends panpsychism.
Interesting.
But in dualism, on the other hand, that consciousness is non-physical, outside of the physical workings of the body and brain. And by the end of my degree, I came to think that both of these were pretty hopeless. And I actually, my end of undergraduate dissertation, I argued that the problem of consciousness was just irresolvable.
Right.
And I went off and did something else and tried to forget about it. But then I came to eventually discover this middle way, this third way, panpsychism, which sounds kind of crazy, but the advantage is, in my view, that it avoids the deep difficulties that face these more conventional options. So that's when I came back to philosophy.
Now I remember, Sharon, when I was doing my undergraduate degree, learning about dualism, and being told by my philosophy tutor that Descartes was really responsible for this view that there's a spiritual substance and a physical substance, and that essentially they're completely separate, but somehow the spiritual works on the physical, and that's the way we are. We're a mind and a body, but they're very separate, different things. I mean, is that one of the options for you? And what are the other options that you explore in your book?
Yeah, so yes, that is one of the options that's out there, that there's an immaterial mind that interacts with a material brain. But of course, the million-dollar question is how exactly does that happen? And how do we measure that? But I think that, there are ways in which that it seems that might be happening all the time around us, the way that kind of speech affects our physical body, the things that are said to us. The nature of information is in itself non-physical, but it seems to have a physical effect, whether that is positive or negative. The effect of cyberbullying on, lack of sleep, or the news of the loss of a loved one on us. These things are. It seems like there are non-physical aspects to reality.
Non-physical
that have an
things
impact.
cause things sometimes.
Yes.
It's
And there are also, in the clinic, there are, I think a huge proportion of neurology, the diagnoses are put in this category of functional disorders, and what that basically means is this is a physical illness for which there is no traceable physical cause. And this constitutes a huge part of neurology. It's just not the case that we're answering all of the questions that we have about the human body and about how it acts. And so it seems like, and then you have things like the placebo effect, where you see that, the mind is powerful in its effect on the body. Which is a slightly different point, but this is all to say that if you are just your brain, you wouldn't see any of these phenomena.
I mean, presumably the materialists, the Daniel Dennetts, have some responses for this. That yes, the brain is very good at fooling us. And when I had him in this very studio, having a conversation with Keith Ward on consciousness a year or more ago, he said it's the mind is the brain's sort of user illusion, is the way he put it, and that we, but ultimately, yes, you can reduce it to the physical activity, and when you poke the brain in a certain way, you have certain thoughts when you do things, and that alone, in his view, proves that it's a physical thing producing what we experience as a kind of user illusion.
Yes, I think from reading your book, Philip, I think we're probably on a similar page in the sense of consciousness being illusory. Is I find there are lots of both scientific and philosophical problems with it. First of all, it is itself a conscious act to say that consciousness is illusory, so you end up just going round and round in circles.
Because you're sort of depending on your consciousness to even assess that conclusion.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And then where does this sense of illusion come from, and how do we know that whatever those forces are to bring about illusion, they're not also at work in distorting Dennett's argument? He assumes that he is independent of the phenomena that he describes. But what if he is subject to the illusion that consciousness is illusory? So it's you can end up going round. And then, of course, he asserts the first person all the time. I believe you've been yachting with him, and no doubt he spoke in the first person on many occasions. And so we don't live as though that is the case.
Right,
and this is where we need to bring philosophy into the real world as well. We can't just have these ideas and arguments. We have to say, look, if something is true and it's going to be an acceptable framework that we take seriously, it has to stack up in the real world as well.
I mean, obviously, we know that there's a lot of agreement between you, but I do just want to hash out the problems you have with the materialist view before we get into your own views on this. And it sounds like you live a very exotic life, yachting with Daniel Dennett.
Wow, what can I say?
I think this was some kind of cruise around the Iceland or somewhere, was it?
In Greenland,
okay.
yes. Funded by a Russian billionaire who's also a pretty good philosopher in the Moscow Center for Consciousness Studies, and wanted to spend some money putting a dozen philosophers on a sailing ship to talk about consciousness and free will.
This is going to cause a huge rush for people applying for academic posts in
this does not happen very often. But I managed to persuade Daniel Dennett he was wrong about something on this trip, actually. So not about everything, but about that.
Well, I tell you what, you'll have to read the book to get that. But
it's a little technical, small point, so I won't go into it. But
I mean, Sharon's elucidated some of the kind of practical problems with claiming that consciousness is simply an illusion. There are some philosophical arguments as well, which you obviously spell out as well in the book. Yeah,
what I'm keen to press is the philosophical underpinnings of this problem. It's not just another scientific problem. And there are a number of ways of getting at this, but for me, the core of the problem is that physical science works with a purely quantitative vocabulary, whereas consciousness is an essentially qualitative phenomenon, just in the simple sense that it involves qualities. If you think about the redness of a red experience, or the smell of coffee, or the taste of mint, you can't capture these kind of qualities in a purely quantitative vocabulary. And so, as long as your description of the brain is framed in the purely quantitative vocabulary of neuroscience, you're always going to leave out these kind of qualities, and therefore leave out consciousness itself, really.
And that's where the book title actually comes from as well, Galileo's Error.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to... I think Galileo's at the root of all this.
Who's to blame?
Although he understood things a lot better than we do now, I think, in some ways. So a key moment in the scientific revolution is Galileo's declaration that mathematics is to be the language of the new science. The new science is to have a purely quantitative vocabulary. But Galileo understood quite perfectly well that you can't capture consciousness in these terms. Consciousness is a qualitative phenomenon, and so you can't capture it in a purely quantitative language. So Galileo said, what we have to do is put consciousness outside of the domain of science. That's in the soul, Once we've done that, we can capture everything else in mathematics. So, this kicks off mathematical physics. People forget, the philosophical starting point, mathematical physics has gone incredibly well. But we need to remember that it was only ever intended as a partial description of reality. The whole project was premised on putting consciousness outside of the domain of science. So why is this important? The problem of consciousness is now taken seriously. It was taboo for much of the 20th century. You couldn't do proper science if you were talking about consciousness. It is now taken seriously, but as I say, many people have this idea, we'll just do a bit more neuroscience and we'll crack it. And I think the reason people think this, and you read this in New Scientist every time there's an article about consciousness, they say, there's a problem, but look at the great success of physical science in explaining more and more of our universe. Of course this should give us confidence that it'll one day crack the problem of consciousness. But I think this is rooted in a sort of misunderstanding about the history of science. The irony is physical science has been so successful precisely because it was designed to ignore consciousness. Right. If Galileo were to time travel to the present day and hear about this problem of explaining consciousness with physical science, he'd say, of course you can't do that. I designed physical science to deal with the quantitative, not the qualitative. Right. I gave it's gone well because I gave it a really limited focus.
I also, from my experience as a scientist, think that there is a sense in which the boundary between the practice of science and then entering into philosophy is very blurry for practicing scientists. Their bread and butter is to study the mechanisms undergirding whatever phenomena it is that they're looking at. And this phrase neural correlates is something that you see come up a lot in the scientific papers. which perhaps leads to the view that, well, if my bread and butter is this, then surely this is going to ultimately explain reality. But it's rare, I think, to see a scientist acknowledge where their scientific methodology and the realm of science ends and where the realm of philosophy begins. And what you end up with, and what we've seen in the last few decades and through history, is you have scientists making philosophical statements about reality that are accepted to be scientifically correct and therefore objectively true. And so I think part of the progression of this conversation around consciousness will involve continuing to bring to the foreground the difference between the nature of scientific explanation and the nature of belief and worldview, which you bring to the science and interpret it. And, when I see things like in a fairly recent version of Scientific American, where it says that brains create thought, well, there's actually nothing in the science that says that brains create anything. What it tells us is that mind and brain are clearly connected, and neither of us are disputing that. That's so clear from the evidence. You put someone in a scanner, you give them a working memory task, their dorsolateral prefrontal cortex will activate. Mind and brain are clearly connected. But to say that brain creates thought is a worldview statement that is brought to the science and is used to interpret it. And we need to distinguish between these two things.
We're going to go to our first break. I hope we've been stimulating your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex or whatever. That's the one. With this conversation today, I'm looking forward to the rest of it as well. We're talking about consciousness, asking ultimately whether it points to God, and we will get to that question with my guests Philip Goff and Sharon Dirckx on the rest of today's show. We'll be back in a moment's time.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.
Well, we're continuing to talk about consciousness, the mind, the brain. Really interesting subject. So many different things I want to talk about on the show today. But great to have with me Philip Goff and Sharon Dirckx. Philip's new book is Galileo's Error, Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness, in which he argues for panpsychism. We'll come to that. Sharon Dirckx, senior tutor at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, is also with us. Am I Just My Brain is her new book, arguing against the materialist view of mind and consciousness. And we'll hear some of the alternatives that Sharon lays out in the book in a moment. I think you want to just respond quickly, though, to what Sharon was saying in that last segment.
Well, just supporting that, really. I mean, I think it's really important to distinguish what neuroscience has to offer, a theory of consciousness, and what philosophy has to offer. And I think we need both. So, what neuroscience gives us, I think this is really just agreeing with Sharon, are correlations, right? But you can scan someone's brain and you can ask them what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, and you can discover that, a certain kind of activity in a certain region of the brain is correlated with a feeling of hunger, for example. And neuroscience has come up with a really rich body of correlations, which is absolutely crucial for any theory of consciousness. But that's not in itself a theory of consciousness, right? What we ultimately want from a theory of consciousness is to explain those correlations, right? Why is it when you have that kind of activity in that region of the brain, you have this kind of feeling? And I really think at that point, we need to turn to philosophy. We need to work out which is the best philosophical theory for explaining those correlations. It could be materialism, could be panpsychism, could be dualism, could be idealism. These are all philosophical theories. There's a common assumption that materialism is supported by science and the others are sort of weird philosophy. But no, materialism is a philosophical position. The science gives us correlations, and then we have to see what philosophical theory best explains them. And all of these theories, at least in certain forms, are empirically equivalent, which is to say, you can't do an experiment to distinguish between them. So I think we need to turn to other ways of evaluating theories, which we might get on.
Well, so far, so much in agreement, in a way, between the two of you. Maybe we'll get to some of the differences you have as we open up the different possibilities that you're both open to. So where do you go with the book in terms of alternative ways of understanding the relationship between body and mind, Sharon?
Yes, so I as a non academic philosopher, I sought to understand and condense and I guess summarize and popularize a vast area, and in doing so recognize that I have kind of smoothed over many categories that philosophers would prefer to uphold, and observe, honor those kind of distinctions. But I condensed it into three main positions, although I did also address panpsychism very briefly, and I'm glad of this opportunity to learn more about this view. That the materialist view being that consciousness is the brain. And then I posited the alternative views that consciousness emerges from the brain, or that consciousness is beyond the brain. So the view that consciousness emerges from the brain is talking about non-reductive physicalist views or emergentist views, which say that when a number of physical component parts come together and increase in complexity, something new emerges from those physical component parts that is greater than the sum of them, but is dependent upon them.
I've heard an analogy for this. I don't know if it's a good one or not, but someone's saying that you can think of the wetness of water as an emergent property of what happens when lots of H2O particles come together. I don't know if that
Yes,
that works.
I suppose that could be one. The analogy that I use in my book is of a university. So take, for example, purely at random, Oxford University began with a number of kind of core building blocks. And you kind of, the departments of, metaphysics, theology, mathematics, philosophy. And that has gradually been built, and a number of kind of other departments have been added over time, and then you end up having students who graduate, so you need an alumni network, and you need to set that up, and then you spread the net wider, so you have an international student body, so you need to do something there, and then this university begins to posit ideas which influence society and culture, and what you have is the emergence of something which is greater than the sum of the original building blocks, and yet is dependent on them. If you were to remove any of those fundamental departments, the emergent properties
why don't we
would themselves
talk about
collapse.
that idea just quickly first of all? I mean, it's still, to me at least, as someone untrained in this area, sounds like compatible with materialism, in the sense that you're not necessarily positing anything apart from the material stuff that makes this up. It's just you're saying, and by the end of it, the way it all works together, you do get something that feels different.
Yes, I think that they're saying that mental properties emerge from physical substances. So there's really only one substance, but it leads to mental properties.
What's your view on the emergent view?
I wonder whether there are two views in this area, because there are stronger and weaker forms of emergence. David Chalmers has this distinction between strong and weak emergence. So weak emergence would be, maybe it's easier to start with strong. Strong emergence would be where you have new basic laws of nature that bridge the gap between the brain properties and consciousness. So this would be David Chalmers' view. He thinks if you just had the laws of physics, you wouldn't have any consciousness, right? We'd all just be mechanisms with no inner lives. But he thinks, as well as the laws of physics, there are fundamental psychophysical laws, and because those laws obtain in our universe, when you get certain brain structures, consciousness emerges. Right. So that's a very strong kind of emergence, and I think of that, as Chalmers does, as a form of dualism.
Right.
It's not Descartes' dualism where you have the soul as well as the body, but there are these non-physical properties that are really genuinely something new, because you need these new laws of nature. Whereas weaker emergence is more like, liquidity and H2O. It's you don't need new fundamental laws of nature. You just put stuff together and it automatically happens. One way the philosopher Saul Kripke famously made distinction. He wasn't a theist, but it was a theological analogy. What does God have to do to create the universe? For the weak emergentist, all God has to do is create all the physical facts. That's it.
And
whereas for Chalmers, God has to add the psychophysical laws to get consciousness.
That's interesting. Do you think that the emergent view is a plausible one, Sharon? And how does it fit with the theistic picture as well?
Yeah, so Again, I think that this view makes sense of the integration that we observe in neuroscience between the mind and brain, by saying that they're kind of very fundamentally integrated. But I think it still runs into problems in the sense of, well, we're still left with the question, well, how do qualities emerge from brain structures? How does the first person experience, the consciousness, emerge from a physical system? You're still left with the hard problem of consciousness that David Chalmers talks about. And if we are indeed in a kind of a closed system of cause and effect, matter, time plus chance, then the hard problem remains as hard as it ever was and ever will be. But if it's true that the system isn't closed, if God exists, the Judeo-Christian framework, then there is information that is inputted into that system, which might even provide a basis for understanding what these psychophysical laws might be. You know, that Psalm 8 describes that God made humans a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honour. The sense that actually we are closer to heavenly beings than we are necessarily to the rest of the animal kingdom, that there is something very different about humanity because there's something that's been extrinsically given in addition to something that is intrinsically part of our sort of physical nature. These two things together make humanity unique and different.
I mean, we could stay on this, but I'd like to go to the other option you mentioned as well, which is the idea that there's actually another thing, that there's something else. And I think that's more the dualist view that we've been already talking about.
Yes.
I think there are plenty of theistic philosophers out there, Richard Swinburne, J.P. Morgan and others, who do hold to this view.
Yes.
Do you want to, again, just briefly explain it and we'll hear what you have to say about
yes.
it? Yes.
So this view, I guess the umbrella term being that the mind is beyond the brain, that we are made of two substances. So whereas the previous position would say there's one fundamental substance that gives rise to everything, this view says that there are two fundamental substances. There's a physical brain and a non-physical mind, or a material brain and immaterial mind. And those two are causally connected. They do interact, but they are distinct and I guess can exist independently.
So there's a sense
other.
in which even if the physical part of our mind were to go,
yes.
It's still intrinsically possible that you could survive that there could be an
there is
unembodied consciousness
beyond the death of the body.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which I suppose maps well onto a theistic view, a Christian framework of the idea that we survive our physical death.
Yes, although there are Christians that hold the previous view, which was, and they would say that actually when the brain dies, that the person dies, but they're recreated all over again by God.
Which is the resurrection of the body is obviously another Christian principle. So.
And it's the love of God that continues your existence, not your mind-body position.
That's interesting. So in a way, both of the positions are compatible with Christian theology at some level.
They are. You might find people saying actually some are more compatible than others. I do think there are hints of a dualistic approach in terms of what's laid out in Genesis, and in terms of, although I don't take those to be scientific accounts of the human person at all, but it does talk about dust plus breath of God makes the human being. And
there's
so
something about the breathing into us of that spirit that brings to life the inanimate in that way.
Yeah.
I mean, as we said, you're not a Christian believer yourself exactly, Philip, but what's your feeling on this and the God connections as well, I suppose, with the different perspectives Sharon outlines there?
I suppose I worry both with substance dualism, the belief in the soul, and with the strong emergentist view of David Chalmers. There's a worry that they sin against Occam's razor, right? This very important theoretical principle in both science and philosophy that we should believe the simplest theory, right? We should postulate as few entities as possible.
But wouldn't that take us to materialism if you applied that?
You should believe. So one way of putting Occam's razor is don't multiply entities beyond necessity. So we've got to wonder what to say. So, first, my starting point is consciousness is real. Nothing is more evident than the reality of our feelings and experiences. So you've got to account for it, right? And I think a materialist view or the weak emergentist view can't account for it because we've got this unbridgeable gap between the quantitative and the qualitative. So I'd rather be a dualist, you know, because that at least does account for consciousness, account for consciousness. I also have worries about it, whether it's empirically adequate. But anyway, maybe. But I think there are more economical options. In fact, I think the view I would ultimately defend, which we can get onto something, is just as parsimonious, just as simple as materialism. And that's why, you know, the main attraction of it. It's just as simple as materialism, but it avoids this unbridgeable explanatory gap that is at the core of materialism.
Well, let's talk about panpsychism then. Feels like the right time to move to that, and we can always return to the God question later. Because this is kind of the hot new thing on the scene, as I understand it, panpsychism. I hadn't really come across the phrase, I don't know, more than 2 or 3 years ago, but now I seem to find it popping up all over the place. It sounds very hippie and new age. Just the name sounds, I'm into that panpsychism, man. What is? but what is? Thank you. What is panpsychism? Just explain it and convince us that it's not some kind of crazy new age stuff.
So I guess this view was laughed at insofar as it was thought of at all for much of the 20th century. I think the reason people are beginning to take it seriously again is partly due to the rediscovery of some very important work from the 1920s by the philosopher Bertrand Russell and the scientist Arthur Eddington, who's incidentally the first scientist to confirm general relativity, Einstein's theory of general relativity. So I'm inclined to think these guys did in the 1920s for the science of consciousness what Darwin did in the 19th century for the science of life. And it's a tragedy of history that it got forgotten about for so long for various historical reasons. But it's recently been rediscovered in academic philosophy and is causing a great deal of excitement and interest. And, you know, part of my motivation for writing this book was to get those ideas out to a broader audience. So the starting point of Russell and Eddington is that physical science doesn't really tell us what matter is. And that sounds like a kind of bizarre claim. You know, you read a physics textbook, you seem to find out all these incredible things about the nature of space and time and matter. But what Russell and Eddington realize is that physics, despite its richness, is confined to telling us about the behavior of matter, about what it does. You know, physics tells us that matter has mass and charge, and these are completely behavioristically defined. You know, charge is defined in terms of attraction and repulsion. Mass is defined in terms of gravitational attraction and resistance to acceleration. This is all a matter of behavior. Physics tells us absolutely nothing about what philosophers like to call the intrinsic nature of matter. You know, how matter is in itself independently of its behavior. So, getting to panpsychism in the moment. What has all this got to do with consciousness? So their thought was, oh my God, there's this huge hole in our scientific story of the world. And basically their proposal is, or at least Eddington building on Russell, put consciousness in that hole, right?
Okay.
So you've got a big hole. We're looking for a place for consciousness in our scientific, put consciousness in the hole. So it's a kind of panpsychism, but it's panpsychism stripped of any mystical or spiritual connotations. The view is there's just matter, you know, nothing spiritual or supernatural, but matter can be described from two perspectives. Physics tells us what it does, describes it sort of from the outside, but matter from the inside, that is to say in terms of its intrinsic nature, is constituted of consciousness. So this is a beautifully simple, elegant way of integrating consciousness into our scientific worldview. It's as simple as materialism without any of the problems.
It sounds fascinating, but there's all kinds of questions going off in my brain at this point. But I should probably hand it over to you, Sharon, to ask some of them. So
what I love about this view is that actually, in a very elegant and persuasive way, in a presumably very fierce and materialistic environment that you're in, you have put the need to place consciousness as primary back at the centre of the conversation. And that's what I love about the panpsychist view. I actually don't think it's necessarily incompatible with theism on many levels.
No.
That might explain the kind of integration. But I would actually just then take our questions one step further back to ask where it comes from. Perhaps we can get to that at the end. And I even think the Genesis account of, dust plus breath doesn't necessarily exclude a theory like panpsychism. And so what I love about, I very much enjoyed reading your book, and what I love about it is that it acknowledges the insufficiency of materialism, the need to start with consciousness and build a theory from there to the human person. And so this is why this is a really helpful conversation.
But here's my question. Okay, first question. So consciousness is there in every fundamental particle in the universe. It's kind of the basis on which we can then do the physical stuff, because consciousness is the kind of, the undergirding reality that constitutes it. But I suppose this, first of all, is the question, well, how do you know that? And B, how does it work so that produces a complex consciousness like you or me?
Yeah.
Are we saying there's simply like lots of different grades of consciousness, and when you get enough of them together, they form a human mind? Or it all sounds like, I don't know. I'm tempted almost to say, if you'll forgive me, like what some of those old-fashioned theories about, phlogiston or vitalism or something that sort of says, well, we can't quite understand it, so we're just going to put this substance in there that kind of explains it. And I can imagine that's what the materialists say. You're just sort of coming up with a consciousness of the gaps or something, because we can't explain this.
Although, there are aspects of dualism that fall into the same situation, and what you end up, and I know you talk about this in your book, that how exactly would an immaterial mind impact on a physical brain? At some point, we have to acknowledge the difference between a scientific theory and a philosophical framework. And there will be things in the philosophical framework you have to land on something that is properly basic, that is taken as given, and that you build from there. And it's just that we agree on slightly different places for that
to land.
I think what I'm most keen to press is that we need to think of consciousness as a datum in its own right, over and above the data of observation and experiment. What is the job of science? We tend to think it's got to account for the data of observation, experiment, job done. But I want to say, well, there's this other thing we know is real, and that has to be accounted for as well. So what do? We have to find the simplest account that can bring together both the quantitative properties of matter that science has been doing very well with 400 years, and the qualitative reality of consciousness. And I think, so you asked me why I believe this view, because it's the simplest, least problematic view anyone has ever come up with, in my view. So, dualism is a cost in terms of simplicity. Materialism has this huge explanatory gap. Panpsychism avoids all these. So that's the,
I guess then my next question is, but I know what consciousness feels like for me in terms of my inner life and experience and so on. But what does it even mean to say that an electron is conscious? Because it's got to be something quite different to what I experience.
Yeah, so it's not, this is going to be some unimaginably simple form of experience that we can't, they're not sitting there having existential angst. But humans have very rich, complex consciousness, horses less so, mice less so. As we keep going to simpler and simpler forms of life, maybe at some point consciousness switches off, but it seems equally coherent and a little bit more elegant to think we keep going down simpler and simpler until we get to basic particles or constituents of reality that have just incredibly simple forms of experience.
Could I ask you just on that, so one of the things that is kind of fundamental to consciousness is the unified experience that we have. We don't have an experience of light, an experience of taste. We experience it all together at the same time. So if there are kind of millions or billions of loci of consciousness, how do you account for the unification of it?
Yeah, well, so there are, no one has a complete theory of consciousness, and there are many challenges in the panpsychist worldview. And I guess what most of the energy of the panpsychist research program is focused on is how to think about the relationship between particle level consciousness and systems level consciousness. Very interesting work by the philosopher Luke Roelofs, thinking about exactly the question you've just asked about the unity in relation to split brain patients. These people who have the corpus callosum in the center of their brain severed and leads to a kind of peculiar fragmentation of consciousness. And that's a sort of inverse of mental combination. The panpsychist trying to make sense of little conscious things, making a unified conscious thing. So he's exploring whether light can be shed on this question for panpsychism from this empirical area. I mean, but what if all else fails? So I think there are a lot of interesting proposals, but if all else fails, one option, which adds a little bit of complexity, but still not as much as dualism, I think, is just to postulate basic principles of nature that bridge the gap from particle level to consciousness, to systems level consciousness. And the philosopher Hedda Hassel-Merck has interpreted the integrated information theory of consciousness by the Julian Tononi, leading neuroscientist, in these terms. So you have the result is there's just a basic principle of nature that in any system you have consciousness at the level at which there's most integrated information. So this is a wonderful example of philosophy and neuroscience coming together.
It strikes me that a lot of scientists are going to have a problem with this, though, for the same reason a lot of them have a problem with the concept of God, which is, but I'm not going to be able to put this consciousness stuff under my microscope and examine it in the way I can with all the physical attributes of the world.
At the end of the day, consciousness is unobservable. People say to me, how do you test panpsychism? You can't look in a particle and see whether it's conscious, but you can't look inside someone's brain and see the... and this is another reason why it's not a normal scientific question, because the thing we're trying to explain is an essentially unobservable phenomenon. So if you either pretend it doesn't exist, and I think... or you're going to have to rethink science a little bit.
And that's why we need philosophy and science together, but to recognise where one ends and where the other one begins. But just to say that I think that I've heard some argue for dualism on the basis of the split brain studies as well, in the sense that, okay, for a time, these patients had a confusion in terms of how they were processing visually and verbally, but they were still one person. There was still one overall consciousness. And so they've argued that kind of, although their perception of vision and their perception of speech and the way that those were processed was varied, it did right itself after a while. And so it's both an indication of brain plasticity, the ability of the brain to change and adapt itself to these very traumatic surgeries, but also that chopping the brain in half doesn't chop the mind of the person in half. You still have one person, and some have used that to argue a dualistic position as well, which I found interesting.
We're already at the end of part 2, I'm afraid, so we'll take another break and we'll be back for some final thoughts and maybe return to the God question as well, and how whether panpsychism can be sort of brought into a sort of theistic perspective, and that ultimate question of, I guess, what is there something that has to underlie even that kind of explanation of consciousness. My guests today on a fascinating edition of the show are Philip Goff and Sharon Dirckx. Make sure to go to their websites and get their books. I'll make sure that we give you those before the end of the show today as we continue our conversation on Does Consciousness Point to God?
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
Well, we're concluding our conversation on consciousness, the mind, the brain. Fascinating stuff today with Philip Goff and Sharon Dirckx. If you want more about Philip and his book Galileo's Error, philipgoffphilosophy.com. That's a Philip with one L and a Goff with 2 Fs. Or you can find him on Twitter at Philip_Goff. And for Sharon, it's theocca, OCCA.org, or at Sharon Dirckx. And, you'll just have to work out how to spell her surname. It's one of the hardest surnames in history to spell because I get it wrong every time I type it in. But anyway, Sharon, what about the God question at the centre of this, which is obviously important in your book? Philip obviously feels that panpsychism gives him a coherent explanation of consciousness, doesn't particularly require a theistic element to it to explain things. Why for you does the God question still crop up, whichever of these different views apart from materialism we might be looking at?
Yeah, well, I want to say that as a scientist who loves discovering the nature of matter and, what we are as human beings, I am all in favour of a science of consciousness and that is better than the ones that we currently have. And actually, whatever emerges in the next few decades, none of that is a threat to God if God exists, much the same as the computer code underlying Facebook is not a threat to the existence of Mark Zuckerberg. These are complementary and compatible explanations. And so I'm not advocating a consciousness of the gaps. I'm not advocating that even if we are positing some sort of immaterial mind that interacts with a material brain, that doesn't mean we have to just relegate it all to the realm of magic and mystery. But even if scientists and philosophers come up with a watertight framework of a science of consciousness, that will still not answer all of the questions that we have about human consciousness. It doesn't answer the question of why there is consciousness that is fundamental in the first place. Why is there consciousness at the microscopic level and then emerging, at higher levels?
Which I suppose is a similar question, even if you had a materialist view. Well, why is there a material universe? It's a similar sort of a question.
Exactly. And so I still think we have the question that I asked as a 10, 11-year-old, why can I think? Why does it exist in the first place? And, when scientists start asking questions of purpose, they often go to origins. They say, well, where does this come from? Can we trace it back to its beginnings? And of course there are, in a sense, your origin is the atomic scale. It's the atomic level saying that there's consciousness that's fundamental at that level. And I guess I would want to say actually is, can we take it back even further? And if we're showing that, the laws of nature alone are not sufficient to explain consciousness, maybe the origins of consciousness lie beyond the laws of nature. And if God exists, does that help us to answer the question of why we are conscious? And I guess that's really where I land in my book, and that's where I land with my views, that if God exists, then consciousness exists outside of time and space as the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, the Trinity, the Godhead, who is conscious. And that God has made human beings to be, in some senses, like him. It talks about, Genesis talks about humans being made in the image of God. And this is where I would kind of slightly counter your argument about simplicity. I would say that if God doesn't exist, your account of simplicity sounds very plausible. But if God does exist, there's a more simple explanation that God made us like him. And if God exists, then it's possible to have a mind without a body, even though in the incarnation, in Jesus, those two things are integrated, and in human beings they are integrated. But if God exists, it is possible to have a mind without a body. And so on the lines of simplicity, then it would make sense that God made human beings possibly with an immaterial mind also that interacts with their body. Although I'm not necessarily fully committed to that, but there is a case for simplicity if God exists.
Yeah, I mean, you said just about there has mystical associations, panpsychism. Just to start, I'm always keen to separate out the question of explaining consciousness from religious or spiritual considerations. Most of the people defending panpsychism at the moment are complete atheists who just think, there's a phenomenon we know is real and we have to fit it into our worldview somehow. Although I can maybe see if you independently have spiritual views, maybe a panpsychist worldview is slightly more consonant with those than a materialist worldview. But I don't know. I'm not sure I agree that there are reasons pointing to God here. So you say, yes, it has to come from somewhere. So the view is that, human consciousness, this very sophisticated thing, arises from millions of years of natural selection, molding together incredibly simple forms of experience. Okay, where does it come from in the beginning? Well, that's the old cosmological argument, isn't it? Where does the universe come from? I don't see why that argument is strengthened if
I suppose
consciousness
my
is
additional
fundamental.
question, though, on top of that is, why does it take the direction it takes? Why does it? Is it? I mean, one might be able to make some kind of naturalistic argument for why evolution produces more increasingly complex creatures.
What's wrong with that?
But why is it the same to say that for some inevitable reason we will develop the complex consciousness we have? Was there any reason why nature should have taken that particular course? Because I might be tempted to say it feels like there's something else going on. There's a guiding hand, if you like, that is bringing about that.
What is it specifically about which aspects of human mentality is the Darwinian account not sufficient to explain? I mean, so I understand if you're a materialist, you've got evolution making things more complicated, and then suddenly a miracle happens, consciousness appears, right? But on the panpsychism story, simple forms of experience, natural selection shapes into more complex forms. What is it about human mentality that needs anything more?
I suppose you still have the question of how exactly do more complex forms arise from simpler forms. So there's still an emergent a question surrounding emergence.
There's a question. I don't see why that points to God, though. Yeah, there are difficulties. This is not no one has a complete theory of consciousness. There are unresolved questions. There are a lot of interesting proposals about how we get from more basic to more complex forms of consciousness. But I don't know, there's a bit of a worry of a God of the gaps, maybe. Right. I don't see anything pointing particularly to God.
I suppose where I'm coming from is that if God exists, it doesn't throw us into confusion about human consciousness. It actually provides a coherent framework for making sense of it, that we are conscious because God is conscious. We think because he does.
So you said, but we still have to, we still have to explain how consciousness fits into our world, and we still presumably want to do that in as intelligible and simple a way as possible. I mean, just because God exists, it doesn't mean we give up on Occam's razor. So so even if once we assume God does exist, I think
the simplest explanation then is that we are conscious because God is. That to me is quite straightforward, and of course it is not contradicting any of the science. It's just another layer of understanding.
But I don't see how
reality.
that answers the question. We still want to know, how does consciousness fit into the world? Dualism, materialism.
So your Occam's razor essentially says we
God
don't need that extra layer that you obviously feel is somehow necessary to understand where consciousness comes from, what it's kind of. You feel like you're not satisfied with stopping at consciousness in that sense, Sharon.
Well, I have questions as a 10-year-old, having not been raised in a religious home, that are asking me about myself and my own existence. Why? Where do they come from? You know, and if God exists, you can kind of make sense of that as well, that we're actually made to ask these kinds of questions, and therefore we need to leave them on the table and accept that, there are certain frameworks which answer those questions better than others, and ultimately, and really where I go is that, arguably we are conscious, we are capable of experience because God is an experience. He's not just an experience, he's objectively grounded in history, and we could talk about historicity and the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus, but he's also a person who can be known and experienced. And I think that fundamentally, if we are made for this kind of relationship and friendship, then consciousness is fundamental to that as well.
Obviously not convinced at this point of this, Philip. I suppose, do you feel like you're closer to a Sharon than a Dennett? Where do you sort of see yourself in this conversation?
That's a good question. Well, if it was the dualism or the non-reductive physicalism, I'd definitely be closer to Sharon. So in terms of explaining, and this is why the four horsemen, they have very different views on consciousness. Dawkins is sort of impressed by the problem. Dennett denies the problem. Sam Harris is probably pretty close to me. Right. But in terms of the, I guess I'm not seeing why any of this points particularly to God, and so maybe in that sense I'm closer.
In that sense,
to Dennett.
maybe only the fourth horseman, Christopher Hitchens, knows the answer to that one at this point. But
I don't know what he thought about consciousness. Actually, that's a good question.
Well, look, it's been really interesting, super interesting actually. It's certainly been stimulating my consciousness across the last hour or so. So if you wanted to get hold of the books, Galileo's Error by Philip Goff, or Am I Just My Brain by Sharon Dirckx, and I'll make sure there are links as well from today's show. You can find that at premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. But for the moment, thank you very much, Philip and Sharon, for a brilliant conversation.
Thank you.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.